Indylive.Radio. The Daytime Show. Indylive.Radio. The Daytime Show. Indylive.Radio.
Hello, this is Leslie Riddick. You're listening to Indie Live Radio on International Women's Day. We choose to challenge because we dare to live full, real lives.
This is Marlene Halliday, and I'm here on the show with Valerie Gold. And this is the fourth and final of our programmes celebrating International Women's Day. Now, when Valerie had the idea of making these programmes, and then when we talked it over, we were thinking of one programme. Quite quickly that became 2 programmes, and shortly after that it doubled to 4. Partly because so many of the women we contacted accepted the invitation to contribute and we wanted to include all of them. And because we wanted music and poetry included in these celebrations of International Women's Day. So the guests I interviewed who are in this final programme are Kirsty Hughes, Michelle Thompson, Lynn Copeland, Heather Anderson and Julie Bell. Kirsty Hughes is a writer and commentator on Scottish, European and UK politics. In 2017 she founded and is now the director of the Scottish Centre on European Relations. She's worked at a number of leading European think tanks, including being based over in Europe for a while herself, and she contributes to a wide range of national and international media outlets. Recently, I know she's been thinking a lot about Scotland and Brexit, but today we were talking about International Women's Day, the theme of Choose to Challenge, and where Kirsty herself has chosen to challenge and where she thinks challenges remain for women now in the world in 2021. And one of the things that Kirsty talked about is how small things matter. Yes, there are big things that have to be faced and challenged, and in getting there, small things matter. That's the name of the track. My next guest in the programme is Michelle Thompson. These days, Michelle is a pretty well-known face in Scottish political circles, and she's standing in Holyrood elections in May. She graduated from the Scottish Conservatoire and she worked as a musician professionally. Then she changed direction and went into financial services, and she has a great deal of experience as a businesswoman. So I was talking to Michelle, we talked about women in business, and that's what this section of the programme is called. We talked about how some language and words which are used as compliments to men can be used as criticisms when directed towards women. I was really intrigued when Michelle started to talk about the need for systemic change, how the systems of how our society and our business work, many of them were set up by men. And even with unintentional bias, there is still bias there, even down to the way computer algorithms provide us with information. There is bias inbuilt to a lot of that, and we need systemic change. The third of my guests this morning is Lynn Copeland. Lynn is the convener of the Geary Women for Change, a group of very active women, all based up in the northeast of Scotland. And Lynn talked about some of the campaigns and initiatives that they've got underway over the last few years. They've included campaigning for the NHS, or rather campaigning to keep the NHS the way it is and to stop any creeping privatisation. They've set up meetings and conversation cafes focusing on climate change. And more recently out of that, they've become interested in economics. How does economics impact on women's lives? Are there better ways to arrange our economy that would improve women's lives? And that's led them to an interest in well-being economics. And of course, we touched on the kind of economics we'd like on an independent Scotland. And my last, but by no means least, guests are Julie Bell and Heather Anderson. They're both on the National Committee of Women for Independence, and they talk to us about ideas and issue and suggestions for policy going forward on matters like food, economics again, well-being economics, And all of this is to be found in Women for Independence Woo Manifesto, which will be published later this year.
Marlene has told you about some of the great guests coming up on the show today, and I'm going to tell you about our other guest, Dr. Nighet Riaz. And Nighet is an academic. She has a doctorate in a PhD in the field of sociology of education. She's a researcher and lecturer at the Institute for Youth and Community Research at the University of the West of Scotland, and she is a great spokesperson for ethnic minority young people and policy practice in education. She also sits on the National Social Justice and Fairness Commission.
Good morning, everyone. Val and I are here this morning, and today we're sitting talking to Kirsty Hughes. Kirsty's a writer, commentator on Scottish, European, UK politics, and I know that back in 2017, Kirsty, you founded and are now the director of the Scottish Centre on European Relations. So thank you very much for agreeing to come on and be a guest with us, and in particular to come and be a guest when we're producing our International Women's Day special daytime show edition.
It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me, and looking forward to the conversation.
Good. So, when it gets this time of year and, International Women's Day is approaching, start to see a few news items about it. And the theme this year is choose to challenge. Does that spark memories for you, or, thoughts about where we are with the position of women worldwide, 2021?
I think, well, you say memories, I think it's always been a case of challenging, and I hope, being optimistic, maybe it won't always have to be. But I was a teenager a very long time ago in the 1970s, and I was a feminist, and I read my Germaine Greer, and at some point, yeah, I started calling myself Ms. or MS, not Miss, and I remember the sort of the pushback I got, and of course people told you, that you couldn't pronounce it, and it was silly, and who would come up with it, and of course now it's on the one hand it's widely accepted, and yet on the other hand we've still got Mrs. and Miss, and yet we've got lots of choices for women, and men still just use Mr. So I think these things can be quite telling. Obviously, we've made, in many ways, a lot of progress since then. That's over 40 years ago. But I think one of the things I've learned through my personal and working life is that progress doesn't always just go in a one-way direction. I think when I was younger, I rather thought it did until you see things going backwards, whether it's going backwards on democracy or quality of the media, or going backwards on female gender stereotyping. I remember being a bit horrified in the 80s as kids' toys seemed to get more and more gender stereotyped and had separate bits of the shop and things that I don't think happened, when I was a little kid in the 60s. So we do need to challenge and choose to challenge, and that can be quite hard work sometimes, or sometimes you think you just can't be bothered, and we can't all do everything. So yeah, I think, we have to not be too hard on ourselves as well, and do what we can when we can.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting, thinking back to, the 70s and the 60s. I mean, I was a kid in the 50s, and, if you were a girl and you asked for a cowboy outfit for your Christmas or your birthday, well, actually, my mum and dad were always fine with that, and they just got me it. But, you'd have other uncle and aunts raised eyebrows and what have you.
I think that's right. These things do run deep. So it may seem a funny place to start talking about Miss, Mrs. or Ms, but it's still there, and maybe we shouldn't mind that there's now a lot of diversity, as long as the diversity is accepted. But as you say, some of it has deep roots and probably does still need challenging. And I look at two of my nieces who have little children at the moment, and they have very different attitudes to what they wanted by way of cards and presents and things. And one definitely wanted sort of pink for the girl and blue for the boy, and the other absolutely didn't want that and wanted white and yellow and green and unisex colours, which was much closer to my attitudes. But at the same time, we have to live with each other, and we've come to different places, I think, don't we?
Yeah. So have you experienced, much of a felt to be different or treated differently in your career up till now?
I wouldn't say I've experienced that much obvious and direct discrimination, let's put it that way. When I got my first job was in 1978, and I went to work in the TUC economics department, which was an interesting time to do that for a couple of years, because it was the last year of the Labour government and then the first year of the Thatcher government. And I think it was something like 12 men and me. And the only women were secretaries who did the typing for us, because in those days we wrote everything by hand and then they typed it up. And then I went and did a PhD, and I went into academia for a while before I went into think tanks by the 1990s. And there were women in universities and women lecturers and women in think tanks, but I was often moving in a very male-dominated environment. I was working on European politics in the 90s in think tanks, and it was very interesting. I got to meet really senior people in the British or the German or the French or Dutch foreign offices. But they were often majority men of them, and some of the time, and I would say throughout my life, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, is that sense of not being taken as seriously. So there's not anything said, but it's just the way you're listened to or reacted to or not really listened to. And I hope that's changed to some extent, but I think that's still there. But I think that gets easier as you stop having the male dominance of certain professions. But I think that's also something that takes a very long time to change. So you've got a lot more women into academic life, for instance, but it's taken much longer to get them into professorships. And we see the same in politics. There are more women in politics in the UK, in Scotland, in Europe, around the world. But there's only, I think, about three parliaments in the world where there's more than 50% of women MPs. So I think dealing with discrimination is a multifaceted thing, but it's certainly helped if you don't have a male-dominated, male-led society. And I think I was looking at these figures ahead of this conversation with you for Europe and how much the European Parliament has improved. And back in 1979, only 16% of the members of the European Parliament were women, and now it's 41%, which is good, but not good enough. It shouldn't have taken that long, and we're still not at 50%. But if you look at today's European Council, where the leaders of the European Council meet, so the prime ministers of all the 27 member states, not with the UK sadly anymore, and it's 23 men to 4 women. And so I think we have to look not just at numbers, but we have to look at hierarchies, don't we? And I think that relates to women's role in society in general, but it also relates, you asked me about my personal experience, and I think it relates to that, because it's not just your personal experience, is it? You're part of this still unfair and still overly male-dominated society, even though, glass half full and half empty, huge progress, and that's great. And it's brilliant to see, Angela Merkel as the most powerful EU politician in the last 15 years, or some really tough women working in the European Commission, just talking about, areas I focus on. But we have to, going back to your phrase, we have to keep challenging, we have to keep critiquing, don't we?
Yeah.
It's interesting what you say, Kirsty. I'm interested in this idea of, being in a very male-dominated environment, just numerically. And I wonder if you've ever had that experience when you're in a meeting and you say something and nobody really reacts, like you make a suggestion, and then maybe 5 minutes later, a man makes the very same suggestion and people respond really positively, and you think, wait a wee second, I only said that, about, has that ever happened here? I think that's quite a common experience, isn't it?
Yes, I think that certainly has happened to me, and I can't think of a specific example right this minute, but yes, that you say something, people listen, or maybe they interrupt, and then they move on, and then a man says basically the same thing, and then the idea is greeted as
yes. And there's that cartoon about it, isn't there? There's some sort of board meeting, and there's a woman on round the table, and she says something, and the chairman says, "That's a very good idea, Miss Smith. Mr. Brown, would you like to make that suggestion?" And it just catches the whole kind of situation there.
And it's both blatant and subtle, isn't it? I think there's been a lot of studies down the years that have looked at those sorts of dynamics of how men and women talk in groups, and that women have to work harder to get in the conversation, and that then men may tend to refer back to what a man said more than they'll refer back to what the woman said. And so you may not feel you're being directly discriminated against, but there's a sort of social signalling and hierarchy going on, isn't there? And that's quite hard to combat, because firstly, partly it depends on you, obviously, and other women. You have to keep pushing yourself and being assertive, and then being put up with being told you're too assertive or you're too tough or things like that men on the whole don't get told. So there's that double standard I've certainly experienced as in sort of being in management positions in organisations.
So I remember seeing a survey that said, a study, not a survey, and it said that it monitored the time that women spent talking in particular meetings and the time that men spent talking, and men's perception was that the women talked far more, even when they didn't. Even when, measured chronologically, the men talked a lot more. The men had the perception that the women were speaking a lot more, which I thought was quite revealing.
I think that's interesting. I find that all the time, that if you're trying to have, obviously we don't have conversations measuring if we've had exactly the same share of time, and we do know if someone has talked at us, male or female, and vice versa. You might think, oh my goodness, I'm doing all the talking here. But I do notice, certainly with some conversations with some men, that if it's a roughly even one, they're actually feeling I'm doing too much talking, and just the signals they give off. I remember 20 years ago, I've mostly worked in think tanks and universities as a freelance journalist, so more, somewhere where I can express my own views. But I worked for 2 years in the European Commission, and I was working for one of the commissioners. It's a sort of French system. They have what they call cabinets. I suppose for our system, it's like being a special advisor, but a somewhat more political or powerful one. I was a deputy head of cabinet, a deputy chief of staff, and very powerful meeting in Brussels every week is the meeting of these heads of cabinet. So they prepare the weekly meeting of the commissioners, and they're almost as powerful as them. And when I was there 20 years ago, there was 19 male heads of cabinet and 1 female head of cabinet. And it gave and I used to there was people like me sitting around, not at the table, but listening and stuff. And it was an extraordinary atmosphere. The one woman was extremely tough. She was a top French diplomat, and the French always sent very good people, including women, to Brussels. But it was a very bizarre thing. And even today, although Ursula von der Leyen, who's the first woman president of the European Commission, so we have to welcome that too, and she made sure finally and belatedly that there was pretty much 50-50 female, male commissioners, although there were 27, it can't be exact, so it's 13 women and 14 men. But there's something like, I think it's 4 or 5 women heads of cabinet, chief of staff at the moment, to, what will it be? I'm trying to think. It's still 27 commissioners, so to about 20 or 22 males. So again, it's coming back to these hierarchies.
Yeah.
It's no use pushing for 50-50 representation or having it in the commission, but not having it at the very powerful levels below that.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, you can understand that moving up through the hierarchy just takes a bit longer, and the first stage is to get 50-50 at say, Parliament level. But do you think, are you optimistic? Is your kind of, if you're in contact with, women of a younger generation, are you kind of optimistic with how they see themselves?
I like to be optimistic about it because otherwise, I'm a big critic and skeptic, but I think pessimism just undermines your energy for this sort of thing. And I also think, I think it's good to say it's outrageous that it's taken this long to get to 41% of MPs in the European Parliament, or that it's not yet at 50-50. And then at the same time, you can say, well, thank goodness that we did achieve that. And it took 40 years and it shouldn't have taken that long. But goodness, at the same time, that is an achievement. And now we have to take it forward and not let it go backwards. And I think when you look at educational figures and tertiary education, you see women doing very well and participating in some cases more than young men. So I think in that sense, it's very encouraging. But I think we're still very confused as a society or societies about gender roles and gender expectations. I'm very concerned, as others are, about the COVID crisis and the effect it's having on all of us, but especially on women who are maybe being pushed back into doing more childcare or in jobs that were more vulnerable to being lost. Or if you think around the world and in developing countries where it's more difficult for young girls and children to get education, and if they miss that crucial step of getting education, that's going to affect their life chances throughout. So broadly, I'm positive. I don't think women are going to get back in their box, and I think it has moved forward. But as I said at the start, I think these things can go backwards a bit as well as forward, and we have to guard against that, and we have to recognise how multifaceted it is, and therefore how difficult, because there's so many things to challenge or debate or see where we agree or where we disagree. Yeah. But it's like that's why we have to fight the small things and why it takes so long, isn't it? Because you are actually changing and trying to overturn a whole system. Yeah. But I was thinking to myself, I was thinking about this Ms thing, and I was thinking, well, if I was 21 again, would I be thinking of calling myself they? Because, at one level, I quite approve of the idea of a pronoun, a singular pronoun that is for men and women.
One last thing is on the surname thing, is I read a really interesting article just the other day saying that, there are quite a few female artists and writers whose work was neglected simply because they got married and their names changed. The recognition of their work was kind of lost because of different There was an article in The Guardian, I think. Anyway, sorry.
No, it's fascinating, and it just tells us all this, language matters, and so it's a really important discussion.
Well, again, thanks very much for doing this. And
you're welcome. It sounds great.
Indylive Radio.
I'm sitting here. It's another Zoom call, and I'm sitting talking to Michelle Thompson. And Michelle is very well-known face in Scottish politics. You're standing in the Holyrood elections in May. I also know, though, that you originally you graduated from the Scottish Conservatoire. You worked as a musician, then changed direction, went into financial services, and you've got a great deal of experience as a businesswoman. So when we emailed you saying, would you like to contribute to this programme to celebrate International Women's Day, what sort of things came to mind?
Well, actually, the first thing I did was to go and look at the the themes for International Women's Day this year. And of course, the hashtag is choose to challenge. And from challenge comes change. So let's all choose to challenge. And that got me thinking about what we can all do to challenge things. And when I say we all, I don't just mean in politics, I mean in business, I mean in education and so on. So I suppose they were my first thoughts when you got in touch with me.
It'd be good to hear your thinking about how things might change in business. You know, I've talked to a few people who've brought up the whole topic about, partly the glass ceiling and working to break through that to get women in, higher echelons of business, but also just expanding the kinds of roles that women maybe think about doing or don't think about doing. I mean, have you seen much of an improvement in that over the years?
I think I've seen some improvement. That's clearly the case, but nowhere near enough. So there are still too few women leaders at the very top in business. There are, despite legislation to try and change it, too few women on boards in executive rather than non-executive roles. There are too few women in all the senior positions. And I would also point out that the systems of how things are done in business are still quite male-dominated. And what I mean by that is in terms of the language. So if you think about some of the words and the language that's used about women, I mean, I know I've personally been called a variety of things in business. Headstrong, for example, bossy is another one. And they, of course, ambitious is another one. And they are words that are only used about women, whereas, of course, ambition in particular is a word that's used in a positive way about men. So it's not just about roles, it's fundamentally about systems, and it's fundamentally about language and narrative of where women are asked to compete in quite often an aggressive and demanding world. When they compete in a certain way, often like men, well, they don't like that. Men don't like that. But then if they're natural and as themselves, as women, sometimes that then means that language is applied to them, such as emotional or whining or hormonal, and so on. So I think we've still got a long way to go, although I do think things are better.
It's a bit of a lose-lose one, that, isn't it? I mean, my daughter's got a mug which says on it, "I'm not bossy, I'm showing leadership qualities."
No, well, I was going to say, I mean, the point about these words is they are only words are applied to women. Have you ever heard a man referred to as bossy? I haven't. And I was going to say that, I remember in politics being referred to by Alan Cochrane as brazen. And of course, he left off the word hussy, but it was certainly implied. And that was another example of a word. I have never heard a man called brazen. And I think I retorted to him over Twitter that brazen was a word that men used about women that refused to know their place. And of course, that creeps into as well that women, even where they have very senior roles, there's some subtle kind of group behaviour goes on in meetings where the expectation is that the woman will wait for the men to speak first. Now, again, that doesn't always happen. I myself have experienced that in certain meetings. Although, in fairness, in business, I've never been called brazen, so maybe that's a good thing.
Do you think it's just a question of slowly, or is there anything else that, say, legislation might do?
I definitely don't think it's a question of slowly. And I know that people will have strong views about positive discrimination, for example, in boards, and legislation has been brought in to do that. But what's tended to happen is that at board level, women have been given what's called non-executive roles, whereas the executive roles still disproportionately go to men. Now, I agree that that legislation had to be brought in, and I would say that more needs to be brought in as well, because things simply aren't changing fast enough. I don't have the figures in front of me today, but I remember when I did calculate it before, that at the rate of change that we've had since that legislation came in, it would still take a ridiculous amount of years to get to parity. So to my mind, what we've done thus far is not enough. So at governmental level, we've tended to focus on kind of public companies rather than private ones. I think more needs to be in private companies. I think men themselves have a very important role, because there's overwhelming evidence that having a balanced and a diverse workplace, incidentally, in a whole range of areas, it leads to much better business outcomes, because where you've got a bunch of men together, and I guess maybe banking's a good example of that, and going back to some of the issues that occurred after the last banking crisis, RBS, for example, was often called out as an example where they had all men on their board. So in my opinion, much, much, much more needs to be done. And men do have an important role as well. We need to value their contribution. They need to call out issues when they see it, for their daughters, for their wives, for their partners, for their mothers. And I do know a lot of good men that will do that as well. And things are changing if you look at the kind of younger generation, but just not fast enough.
Just not fast enough, yeah. So is that implying that when you do have women in those situations, there's a sort of expanded range of values that come into the discussion? Yeah.
Well, yeah, because women, if you look at your typical kind of like women's lives, and take, for example, the pandemic at the moment, we know that the impact of the pandemic has fallen disproportionately on women. For example, key sectors like hospitality have been badly affected, and many, many women work in hospitality. We also know that in terms of keeping the kind of home unit going, more of the work has been undertaken by women. More women have given up working to support the family through this time. So it almost seems like the endemic level of our society is working against women. But going back to your point about women's experiences, I mean, I know when I worked both part-time and full-time in business, I mean, my husband's great and I can't complain about him. He certainly pulled his weight. But I had many friends and colleagues who basically worked full-time, sometimes managed. I mean, I had probably about 7 male managers that reported to me, all of whom complained incidentally about how hard their lives were, even though some of their wives weren't working. But many women I knew at that time were kind of doing it all. They were working full-time, they were managing these big departments, and they were running the home, both from a financial perspective and doing the kind of organisation of the kids, right? You've got whatever football today and there's your strip and so on. Yeah. And I think a lot of that still goes on, and to be honest, I think that these are the more minor, easy examples that people can latch on to. The big picture, which goes right back to the politics, is our systems, if you like. Take, for example, our legal system. It was developed by men. Women didn't have a seat at the table. Our financial systems are based on systems developed by men, and women didn't have a seat at the table. Everything that we're doing nowadays has an IT component. Algorithms are built to quickly process various transactions when we're all doing stuff on computers, like our insurance and so on. Now, how many of the people developing the algorithms, the computer programmers, are men? it's still in the majority. They're developing them on kind of biases in society that men hold. And it's almost like it's building in even further our system's bias against women. And that is a concern for me going forward. So it is a much bigger picture and debate than just what's happening in business. It's a fundamental level of all of our societies.
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, that's interesting thinking about a systemic change, even on that nitty-gritty level of algorithms. Do you think the current, I was going to say enthusiasm, maybe that's too strong a word, but the current interest in thinking how to implement a well-being economy, do you think that's something that's going to come to the fore? It does sound like it might be something that would help address that imbalance you've been talking about.
Well, I mean, I would hope so, because a well-being economy in its purest sense takes account of all these different facets of our society. And it would be a welcome step forward from where we've been. I was watching a TV programme the other night talking about class and how it's affected people through the ages and what do people feel about their class. But what struck me about the programme was that it didn't mention sex within class. I mean, it pointed out there was previously an upper class and a middle class and working class and so on. But what it didn't point out was that women were subjugated regardless of their class. You know, and if you look back to the days when if there was a wealthy woman and she inherited something, she would promptly lose all that or require to give it away to her husband. And the programme talked about class, but it talked about class from a male perspective. And I thought even now when people are doing that, they didn't bring in how important sex is into the debate. So I do hope that talking about well-being will start to bring that in. But again, I think more significant change needs to be made. We're just not getting there fast enough. And if anything, I would argue that the current incarnation of the Tories in Westminster are leading the UK backwards. I mean, you know, they've removed various roles. I mean, I've had some quite outrageous adverts, you know, going back to the days when a family was only about the women did the kids and the man worked and so on. So we've got a real challenge within the UK. And of course, Scotland has always done more. And I hope that we continue to do more. I think it's really important.
Great to talk to you, Michelle, and thanks very much for agreeing to come on the programme.
Hi, I'm Sheena Wellington, and you're listening to Indie Live Radio on International Women's Day. Have a good one, and always remember, if your boyfriend tells you can't do something, tell him to sling his hook.
I'm delighted to have with me today Dr. Nighet Riaz. Nighet is an academic, a community and political activist from Glasgow. Hello, Nighet.
Hi, Valerie. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. I'm so glad you found time in your very busy schedule because I know you work extremely hard. So the first thing I'd like to ask you is really your take on what does International Women's Day mean to you as a woman, and also maybe a comment on this year's theme, which is Choose to Challenge.
An interesting question. And firstly, I can never say no to you, Valerie. So thank you once again for having me here. International Women's Day and the theme that they've chosen for this year, Choose to Challenge, are part of my everyday life. You know, I'm 54 this year, and I remember right from a very early age being one of 7 sisters and living in an extended family. My parents were from Pakistan. How the family would fall into mourning every time one of my sisters were born, very much because they valued women as burdens, as a financial burden, a reputational burden, rather than to be valued in their own right. And where boys were seen as like future breadwinners and looking after their elderly parents at that time. So it's been against that kind of background of growing up. My sisters and I have challenged it every step of the way. We've chosen to do things our own way. And whether it's in our homes or whether we wanted to return to education, I was told, I'd be better off learning how to cook more effectively and do my ironing, stay in that kitchen, all that kind of stereotypical nonsense that many women in communities across the world have to face. And I thought, no, but, great, I'll do that. But there has to be more in life. So I used opportunities that were given to me to go back to college, to study, to make sure that my own children, I treated all three of my children equally. I have 2 boys and a girl. I will not feed into any of this cultural nonsense that daughters are a burden. No, my daughter's fabulous. Thank you very much. She's independent. She's feisty. She's a single mother, and I'm just proud of every day of how she looks after herself, how she supports her child now. So it's about making sure that we fight for equality. We fight to be heard. We don't fall into stereotypes. And I've done that when I entered the political sphere, again, because I wanted to make a difference. Very much enjoyed the majority of my time in that space. But again, towards the end, it was very much about challenging the narrative of social justice, equality, and fairness. I felt that, well, what did those words actually mean to marginalized communities, to our disabled communities, to the LGBTI community? It was just like, well, I know what it means for the white middle class members of our society, but how does that translate? So that fed into my research as a doctoral student and now a researcher, and some of the work I'm doing for another organization where I'm looking at embedding race equality in our universities and colleges. So it's been that kind of journey where, it's about holding up that mirror to power, to say, please look, this is what you want to see for yourself. How does that actually translate into other sections of our community, of society? And what can we do better to look at inequalities that we have to traverse on a daily basis?
It's really interesting. That is hugely interesting, because you're talking about that from a personal perspective, from your own experience in your own family, but also in your own professional and academic career, and politically as well, which is linked but separate, that you have challenged not only stereotypes about women, but also, I know through your work, through anti-racism, and sometimes that can be through saying things. When I read some of the things you write, it by virtue of being challenging, it has to make you feel uncomfortable, and as a white person I read it and I think, and you are challenging people's, you're taking people out of their comfort zone and making them think about things, about unconscious bias and so on, that I think it's so important. And you're backing it up with robust academic research, which is really important. So would you say that women in academia, would you say they bring a different perspective than male academics to that kind of challenging of stereotypes, or does it depend on the person?
I think it depends on the person. It's very much about where they see themselves in academia. Do they want to be in a position of power? What steps will they take to get to that position of power? Some will take on a mantle for the sake of being seen as a champion or an advocate until they get to the position that they want, and then they become the very gatekeepers that we rally against. And there are others that will consistently take academics with them once they are in that position of power. So they have a louder voice around that table where they are heard and where their decisions are taken on board. And as a woman of colour, when you talk about discomfort, when we talk about racism, it makes our white colleagues very uncomfortable, and quite emotional at times. But what we'd like to do is we'd like them to turn their gaze and look at us and say, well, if it makes us uncomfortable, these people, that is their daily lived experiences. How do these microaggressions affect them, their mental psyche, because they're not being validated or they're being dismissed as like, we don't want to see it. Therefore, we don't need to take that responsibility and accountability. So it's very much about saying, no, we are here. We're here. I'm here as a woman of color, as a parent and a grandparent, saying that what happened to me in the 1970s, I do not want to see a repeat of that for either my children or my grandchildren. To me, Scotland says all the right things, and I want to believe in them. And we've done fantastically well on some very progressive policies. But to me, when I scratch the surface, I actually want to see evidence and action. And that is what I will disrupt the narrative.
More radical change.
Radical change.
Rather than just lip service to.
And I think that being a member on the Social Justice and Fairness Commission, having that voice along with Michelle Campbell and Julia Strakowska and Graham Campbell, having that ethnic voice has kind of empowered us to have a lot more to say about how we want a future and independent Scotland to look like.
That's really reassuring, and great that you have these strong voices with Julia and Michelle, who I believe is standing for a Parliament for Holyrood, and Graham too. So I hope they wish them the best, obviously.
Definitely. Having someone like Michelle with her background would be phenomenal for the Scottish Parliament.
She has a background as a nurse in the National Health Service and mental health, doesn't she?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Really
useful. In fact, I think she came tantalisingly close to being selected as a constituency candidate. Was it not one of the first time ever that there was a tie in the selection ballot, and she tied with another person and they had to rerun it, and she was narrowly defeated? So hopefully she may have a chance of being regional. Anyway,
I hope so.
Yeah, but so one last thing, you're talking about racism and universities, and I must say I haven't read all the details, but I was quite horrified recently. I live quite near the university, and I'm an alumna of Glasgow University, and I was really horrified recently to see the survey that was done, and I believe that Anton Muscatelli publicly apologised for it, to say that there was a huge incidence of racial harassment on campus. You kind of think, well, the campus is like in the middle of the city, and maybe people could experience harassment. But the idea that students at the university would, I think that it was a shocking figure. It was like 50% had experienced racial harassment on campus. And I found that profoundly, I'm looking for a word that's not an understatement, not disappointing. I was just disgusted to hear that. I mean, is that something that squares with your experience as an academic?
It's the Equality and Human Rights Commission. They published a report in 2019 called Universities Challenge. They found very similar findings of racism towards students and staff. And the Glasgow University report was in response to that. And I'm glad, because these are very honest conversations. They need to be had for that kind of race audit to happen, to say, well, this is what's happening and how are we going to address these issues to create a safe and socially equal and just environment for all students to take place, where there is that respect and dignity given to both, BAME staff and students. So because I am part of that area where I am looking at creating a toolkit, which is funded by the Scottish Funding Council, and the project is led by Advance HE. Khadija Mohammed, a senior lecturer and programme leader at UWS, is the chair of that steering group, which is made up of 12 mainly BAME professionals, academics and postgraduate students who have that lived experience and academic knowledge that they've brought to the project, where we've created a set of assets on how to tackle racism and to be able to talk about whiteness, racism and race in a much more confident manner. It's to take away that stigma. It's about making people aware of what a microaggression is, why there could be something they say could be seen as offensive. It's like somebody goes, well, where do you really come from? It's about having that person should have that understanding of why that can be seen as offensive, because it's very much signaling that person that's been asked the question as an outsider and not belonging. So it could be done in a more diplomatic manner. So it's about looking at language and how we can be kinder. It's about looking at the terminology, and it's about looking at our leadership within our universities and colleges, taking more responsibility and ownership of tackling racism. And we did have a declaration against racism by universities and colleges last August, which was phenomenal. Richard Lockhead, the Minister for Further and Higher Education and Sciences, he endorsed a statement against racism. But this is brilliant, but what we do need is more than words. We need to see action.
Material change.
We need to see that impact of whatever we've created. We need to see it being measured year on year, and to ensure that accountability and responsibility stays there. It's just not yet another tick box exercise. It's not at the expense of other issues. It's like, when we look at gender equality, race equality, LGBT and disability, they should all be funded equally, because they, only by looking at society as a whole and by tackling the inequalities at the same time together, can we hope to bring the rest of society with us.
Well, that is great, and I'm sure that anyone listening will be grateful that they have such a passionate and eloquent advocate speaking on their behalf. Also through the Social Justice Commission, which is a really good initiative. I think it's only been going for about a year, is that right?
That's right, yes. And we will have the report out in the next few weeks, so keep an eye out for that.
Will do. And so I'd just like to thank you very much indeed, Nighet, for taking the time to talk to us today on our International Women's Day special. And I hope you'll come back again in the future and speak to us again.
It was a pleasure as always. Thank you so much, Valerie.
Indylive Radio.
This is Marlene. I'm back. I'm sitting here with another of our guests for this morning's International Women's Day special daytime show edition. And I'm now sitting here with Lynn Copeland. We're going to be talking to Lynn for a few minutes. And Lynn, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the programme and have a chat with us.
You're very welcome, Marlene.
So we know you're a activist, and we know that you've got concerns about climate change. We also know you're involved with Mums for Scottish Independence, and we know you're involved with the Geary Women for Change. You've just been telling me that a few years ago you went down to Edinburgh for one of the International Women's Day celebrations. So this year the theme is Choose to Challenge. Does that spark memories for you of being down there before, or thoughts about where are we with position of women worldwide in 2021, or even just a bit more at home with your own group, the Geary Women for Change?
Well, we established Geary Women for Change way back, as you know, Marlene, around 2017, and then the first ever event that we held was the Suffragettes Centenary. We marked that really well. We filled a local hall with about 200 odd women, and we got women from every political party to come along and chat to us and tell us more about the actual, how to get into politics. They got us all fired up. Filled us full of confidence, and it was a good thing, because that was why we established Geary Women in the first place. And as I say, it was quite a wide range of political opinion. Still is amongst the group. We all have our own ideas about how things should be going forward. But one thing that does keep us all together is this, this idea, women are very, very, they get things done, don't they? Do you know what I mean? They get in a group and they get things done. And we sit down and we talk about different issues, political issues, and about women's issues, women's concerns, and how the political people are performing for us, really, how our government's coming through with results and that. Last time we spoke, I think we spoke about the NHS, and we spoke about Garda Women's Safeguard or Scottish Health Service, where we actually we trained facilitators on the back of a wee grant that we managed to get from a group in Scotland, SIF. So they gave us some money to go and train facilitators so that we could bring the message out about the NHS, and that we'd go out into the community, go to all the various different village halls. And that was tremendously successful, we feel, because a lot of people don't actually know what goes on behind the scenes at the NHS. There's so much propaganda on television, etc. So we highlighted a lot of issues as regards that. And we did raise awareness, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people would know an awful lot more about the stealth privatisation of the NHS down south, etc. Yeah. We kicked that one off just after the Suffragette conference in 2018. So there's so much happened since then. Even since the start of our campaign, there's been changes. Brexit's happened. Yeah. We now had the Internal Market Act, it is now, 2020. And also we've got this trade bill that's coming along. Now, these incorporate an awful lot of the topics to do with the actual stealth privatisation. Public procurement, for example, is a big feature of the NHS. And when we spoke last time, I think I spoke about how Westminster had decided to roll over, if you like, certain elements that were coming back from the EU. And they were doing this using, it's a thing called Statutory Instruments, which means that there's no debate and there's no vote about anything to do with it. They just simply roll them over and they become part of law. And what would happen is that they would look to have a common framework right across the UK. So this has implications, obviously, for Scotland, in that they may well decide that they want public procurement to be, the common framework throughout the whole of the UK. And that would impact on the NHS, because the NHS is actually, that's the bedrock of the NHS, is the public procurement aspect.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, back when, the NHS in the UK as a whole was being set up, and probably before that, there was probably a generation of women there who were having similar conversations about what they want for the NHS, and it was really important to do this, that, and look after, women's health, and obviously not just women. But do you see what I mean? There was probably a struggle, at least at some point way back then, and if you think worldwide, I mean, you certainly come across stories, in the being reported in the news about women in developing countries, and they're having to, push their politicians to set up better healthcare provision. And yet here we are back in the UK 2021, and to some extent we're having to restate those whole arguments. Another kind of generation of women having to come to the fore to try and, in our case, it's to protect something. But how do you feel yourself? I mean, are you, sort of optimistic about, how direction of things are going with respect to women's position in the world, or, is it a time when maybe we do slip back a bit?
I think possibly a bit of both, actually. There's so much that we have achieved in terms of improving conditions for, in childcare and all this other good stuff. Education-wise, women are involved in a wide range of professions now. There is no stereotypical kind of approach to things now. Women can be what they want to be. That's a very positive aspect. And I think as well, in my own background, I'm a scientist, so in my own background, it's good to see that there are young women that are very keen to put themselves forward in that kind of sphere, in the STEM, subjects, and try and get themselves into engineering, all sorts of, medical related type stuff. And in Scotland, we've got the highest percentage of bioscientists, in the UK. We have a tremendous amount of bioscience, and it's one of the areas in the economy which is really progressing rather well. I think the Scottish Government had set a target that the biosciences would increase, the GDP by a certain percentage, and that was exceeded. It was just spent beyond their expectations as far as that's concerned. And that's something that doesn't get an awful lot of, publicity. But as far as women are concerned, there's a lot of women work in labs, because of the dexterity, with the smaller hands, and that does come in. It does come into play from time to time.
Pay attention to detail and keep the records, well up to date. Yeah, I know.
Multitasking,
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I know what you mean, because my daughter's 40 now. Oh, don't know how that happened, but anyway, when she was maybe second or third year in secondary school, and we were in a parents' evening, so my husband and I we're chatting away to her physics teacher, who was also the head of the general science department, and we're chatting away, and he was saying how good she was at physics and math, chemistry, and then he sort of paused and he said, I just wanted to say that, we're sure that she would be very good going forward, specialising in these subjects. It's just that, sometimes we know that parents, of daughters are a little bit, wary sometimes of their daughters doing that. And then my husband and I burst out laughing and said, yeah, that's okay. You don't have to worry about that with us, because we're both scientists, and we'll be, do what she wants, but if that's what she wants to do, that's great. But it did. Well, it's obviously because I've remembered that, because I did think, well, even then, what was that? 25 years ago. Even then, there was a teacher who was wanting to encourage girls to go into and study that, but also just aware that there might be a bit of resistance coming from their families, and doing his best, actually, very tactfully, to manoeuvre around that. It's not that long ago, isn't it? I mean, 25 years. Hopefully, even that doesn't need to get said now by physics teachers when they're talking to their parents.
I think it's quite important, though, that women are taking different direction because of the business with climate change.
Yes.
Because Gay Women had, just before lockdown, in fact, about a week or so before lockdown, we filled the town hall again in Inverurie, and brought in speakers from all over on all different subject areas to do with climate change. And we got a phenomenal response for that as well. It was called the Eco-Emergency Event.
Ah, right, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it covered a multitude of things. We had a huge screen in the hall, and we played different films about people recycling things, and other films about the environment, and biodiversity, lots of different subject matter on the videos. We had stands as well, a few stands from, different people were there as well with different subject matter again. And then we had ongoing upstairs, we had lots of different seminars. So we had like 3 different seminars going on at the same time. And we were really quite, we were very, very pleased at the outcome of that.
Fantastic.
People said, oh, yeah, that was really great, when you have another event and all this. And we had planned to actually have follow-ups to that. And we had some funding left over, and we were looking to have climate cafes.
Oh, yeah.
But of course, with the lockdown and all that was knocked on the head, So, but we continue with that. We've got a Facebook page, and we often put up information about climate, every aspect of climate change, innovation, new product, and but also, there was a really interesting girl, a young woman called Jane Morrison, who is part of an alliance, Wellbeing Alliance. And she was there, and she was very good. She wanted to people to participate in what she was doing in her session, and that was really, really good. And they are allied, Jane Morrison's group are allied to a woman called Catherine Trebek, who wrote the Economics of Arrival.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting, and that's another area that women are underrepresented in, is economics. So here we were, we're fortunate enough to have Jane there to explain things to people. And that really stirred our interest. We got going on that. And we started to look at things that were topical, the Scottish currency, looking down the line at what would happen post-independence, how, that would be tackled and everything. It was just really, really interesting that there are all of these women out there that are writing books and doing presentations, etc., formulating all sorts of economic policy.
Yeah.
And sort of, breaking the mold kind of thing. Your idea of an economist is some geezer in a suit, shirt and tie in a suit, talking all sorts of mathematical models and everything of that kind,
Yes. And I mean, it's true, isn't it? There's a business about breaking through the glass ceiling, which probably was, are still in the process of doing, or at least the higher echelons of that. But you're right, there's also just breaking out the mold of what kind of, interests or jobs or careers or anything that women should be doing. And I mean, obviously no reason why they shouldn't be doing all of them, all or any of them. Well, look, it's been really great talking to you. And once again, thanks so much for being prepared to come on and, just give us your ideas, thoughts, experience that we can put out in the programme. So thanks again, Lynn.
Thank you, Marlene.
Hi, I'm Kayla Mcmahon. I'm the convener of Young Scots for Independence, and this is Indylive Radio for their International Women's Day special. And I think this year is even more special because the message is choose to challenge. And I think for all of the women in the independence movement, that is so important, that we are challenging the norms and challenging the narrative, not only of the union, but of our own movement, and making sure that we're bringing absolutely everyone with us so that our independent Scotland will be home for anyone who wants to call it that.
This is Marlene again, and it's another day, and it's another Zoom meeting with more guests for our International Women's Day programmes. I'm sitting here with Heather Anderson, who's a councillor down in the Borders, and Julie Bell, who's a councillor up in Angus. But as well as doing that, both of them are on the National Committee of Women for Independence. So we've got you here to talk this morning, and what did you think? Maybe Heather, if we go to you first, when you got the email from us, saying would you like to contribute to a programme about International Women's Day, what sort of things came to mind?
Well, lovely to be back. Great to be on the show. Thank you for inviting me. The thing I thought that might be of interest is Women for Indy haven't been quiet. They've been working away since back in 2012, and one of the things we've been working on is a manifesto, which we're certainly going to use in the next independence referendum, which will hopefully be soon, but we may also have it ready for the Holyrood hustings that are coming up. And the way that we've done a manifesto is meet and discuss things with loads of women. So I played a part in national councils over the years on food, farming and the environment, because as you know, I'm an organic farmer, and campaigner on land reform and land use. And we just had this fantastic day in Glasgow, when we were allowed to meet and be sociable. There must have been about 120 women there, very feisty women. And I did a presentation on all the issues, and then we put them into tables of 10, and they got 50 odd statements, which they had to sort into the 10 commandments of food. And then we went round the 11 odd tables. Wow. And we took the top commandment from each table, and we eventually whittled it down to the top 10. So it's just brilliant stuff. So it covers things like everyone can afford to give their children nutritious and tasty food, and healthy and nutritious food is affordable. It's got great things like all workers in food, from farmers to waitresses, earn the living wage. Yeah. Our public kitchen uses local food and cooks from fresh. So very straightforward things. One of my favourites is our cattle, sheep, pigs and poultry are treated kindly and humanely. And because it was a group of women, they refused to stick to the rules. So one of the 10 commandments is, this is one commandment, we are restoring soil health and increasing soil carbon, and there will be more trees on farms locking up carbon and providing shade for livestock, and we have halved our use of antibiotics in livestock and pesticides in food.
There's about 6 commandments in that one.
So there's more information and content in that one commandment than in most books that are written about farming. So, and there's a lovely one about when land changes hands, the potential owners have to show how they will manage the land for public good. So there was a real debate about all the issues on the environment, management of, caring for livestock, producing decent food, and this whole thing of it can't be that good food is an elitist privilege. It has to be that good food is an absolutely basic right. Everybody should have the right to access, afford decent food. There's a lovely one here of every woman who wants to grow food should have access to land to do it. So you can imagine the energy and the debate and, saying, well, we'll say this, and somebody says, could you just put a bit in there about soil health? So I think we've got a really robust and powerful section on how we see ourselves in relation to the land and food production, and how we convert that into really basic human rights and taking pride in how we look after our land and feed our families. So fantastic. It's a joyous day.
And presumably, that would be women from all over Scotland who congregated in Glasgow. Yeah,
a real rabble of people.
It sounds like you've got a ready-made crowd of hecklers for the next hustings as well.
That's right. And just that great thing about people learning in live time. So, people who might have got stuff about food hadn't necessarily thought about chicken and cattle or soil health, but they put it all together and they make sense of it really quickly. So it was a wonderful day and really strong statement. So I'm really keen that we campaign and advocate for this to be just part of what we do, and that the right to food is a basic right, not a privilege.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, just hearing you just read those out, what struck me was just how interconnected all those things are. On the big scale about health of soil and carbon kind of storage and everything, how you look after the animals, but also just on the level of a bit more individually, like, yes, good food, but also the income to be able to, afford that good food. It's fantastic hearing that.
And just to come back to that point, they're also to do our history. So, we had the largest scale removal of people from land in the history of the world, and people came from farming and went up to a tenement without a kitchen in the 1700s. So that whole thing of living on sugar that was imported from the colonies, so bread and jam, and not cooking and not having a kitchen is very deep in our culture. Yeah. So a lot of Scotland's relationship with food is to do with Scotland's relationship with land.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And whether we think we're worth it.
Yeah.
We have to think we're worth feeding well.
Yeah. And Julie, I see you've got your hand up, as it were.
Yeah, I'd love to come in on that, actually, because we did a couple of events around the economy with Angela O'Hagan from the Scottish Women's Budget Group at one of them. And I know that sounds a really dry discussion, but actually it was incredibly powerful, because it is issues like the introduction of a universal basic income to address some of the issues that Heather was raising there, but not just in an independent Scotland, but while we're getting there, looking at our economic policy to make sure it's gender competent. We can't deliver on a well-being economy unless it is gender competent. And I think the pandemic has shown us, if anything ever has, the importance of addressing those inequities in the economy where we can deliver on a more caring economy. The vast majority of our frontline workers throughout the pandemic are women. They're occupations that are gender segregated quite often. Women have borne the brunt of the childcare and the homeschooling during the pandemic. Quite a lot of women have lost their jobs or have had reduced hours because of being locked down. And women academics as well have had a huge impact because of all the homeschooling and the additional care responsibilities. So when we address the importance of those frontline workers, including retail workers, we really know who key workers are now. Mm-hmm. We need to properly value them. And I include unpaid carers in that. It's a massive issue. And that's something that my coverage of International Women's Day is going to take on board. I'm running an event on Thursday around a wellbeing economy, a gender budget, and looking at just how the current structure does not work well for women and what we could do to address it. And in fact, another issue that's come up through the pandemic for us in Angus is how women access support throughout the pandemic. And we're piloting a women's centre model with our community planning partnership. The third sector is leading. I think the third sector really stepped up to the plate and is an absolutely vital part of our economy. Our volunteers and our paid staff within the third sector have been pivotal in helping us to deliver on support who've shielded, those unpaid carers who are part of that cohort. And we really need a discussion nationally around how we truly value the caring economy, because that will impact us all. If you look at things like shopping, working, eating, supporting locally, what we have, that also ties into the sustainability agenda and more active travel as well. So you're right, it is very holistic, which is exactly the way I like to look at things. So if you address those inequities, for example, you're actually creating a much better society for everybody, not just women.
Indeed. So is the wellbeing economy something that you'd like to really see developed and taken forward then at Holyrood?
Well, very much so. And that, I mean, the policies around fairer duties are already pretty well embedded in what the current Scottish Government is doing. So it's really about stepping up with a few gear changes to address that structurally. And we'll have a proper opportunity to do that when we are independent. Mm-hmm. But there's lots that we can do at the moment, I think. And when you look at, uplifts in the national living wage and NHS staff salaries, I think we need to keep addressing that because it is a challenge attracting and retaining clinical staff. And I know from working in the NHS and being involved in Public Health Scotland and our health and social care partnership in Angus, our frontline carers, whether they're in the NHS or social care or the third sector or the private sector, are stretched to the absolute max. And we need to make sure that these are posts that continue to attract people, that we have enough capacity to meet demand with an older population. And we need to work at the other end as well to address those health inequalities that have been absolutely exacerbated by the pandemic. There were issues that existed before, but the people who've been most affected are even more affected because of the pandemic. And the increase in concerns around mental health and resilience, distress and trauma actually affects not just people who've been bereaved or who are surviving with the long-term effects of COVID, but our frontline staff. Vicarious trauma is an issue, and we are seeing that in our workforces. So, these are big concerns that won't be fixed very quickly. Mm-hmm. So we need to be able to look to the longer term to address that, so that people can thrive and we don't leave anyone behind.
One of the issues in the manifesto is around getting powers over immigration. And that ability to attract workers and prioritise different professions. So there's a commitment in here about midwifery and attracting people from around the world to come and be midwives and giving it a higher profile as a profession. And one of the really interesting things that happened in this pandemic is the dominant image through the whole of COVID have been carers and nurses. And health professionals. Yes, and I just keep thinking back to in the 80s, I'm quite old, in the 80s, the dominant image was bankers drinking champagne. And you just think, so there's all these young people growing up and they're seeing a valued role that's not a banker or a stockbroker, it's a carer or a health professional. Now that will have a long-term impact on what we think it's worth doing. And the good side of the COVID pandemic has been that we have prioritised older people. We have taken very seriously protecting and looking after older people. And we've now got this commitment to a national care service. And Jean Freeman basically changed the pay structure so that everybody in the care sector was given the living wage and was given enhanced health, sick leave. So I think there have been very definite steps to say this is who we are, these are the people we value, these are the professions that we want to invest in. This is our long-term future, that we're going to look after our people and train the people who look after them well. And the same with nursery nurses. That entire profession has been restructured, funded with a huge investment in early learning and childcare and professionalisation of the job. So these are things to be proud of and work towards.
Yeah, and I mean, Jean Freeman's had a hard time the last year with doing that job, and she's done it really well. I mean, the first meeting, the Women for Independence meeting I went to in Glasgow. She was there, kind of talking.
No, you think she's the cabinet secretary, and we think she's a Women for Indie board member.
Yeah, same with Philippa Whitford. She's on Newsnight and everything else, and then you think, she was at that meeting as well. So, it was such talented women. I mean, they're not the only talented women that are at that meeting, but they're sort of stuck in my mind because they've got such a high public profile now. But so. This manifesto, you're hoping to be able to take it to the upcoming Holyrood elections. Is that right? Or
well, it was certainly intended for the referendum, the next referendum, as asks for what we would like to see in an independent Scotland. But there's material in there that all the political parties could benefit from perusing, I think.
And they've stolen some of our ideas. So an end to period poverty and support during the menopause. You think, good, it's good. We just need to get it out there, and they could steal some more ideas.
Steal some more, exactly. Yeah. Feel free, really. It might as well be. When you've got good ideas, you just have to be generous with them. Yeah. So listen, Jules and Heather, it's been really great sitting talking to you, and thank you so much for joining us today and on this particularly celebration of International Women's Day. Just thanks very much for coming.
We hope you enjoyed today's programme, and maybe you managed to listen to some of the other shows in a series of 4 that played on Indylive Radio on Friday, Saturday and today. These 4 shows will be repeated, and I'll give you details of that in a minute, and they'll be available on demand. Marlene and I would like to say a huge thank you to all the women who've given so generously of their time to speak to us and do interviews for you. And I'll just remind you of a few of who they were in case you would like to catch up in future. On Friday, we featured Rosa Sallee, Isabel Lindsay, Clacks Women for Independence, Shona Craven, Alison Thulis and Agnes Tommy. On Saturday, we featured Ruth Wishart, Bridge Smith, Rahana Abid, Kayla Mcmahon, Vivian Martin and Renee Slater. Earlier today, the show included Sheena Wellington, Leslie Riddick, Tina Yu, Anamisha McCoy, Jean Anderson and Eileen Budd. And today's show you heard from Kirsty Hughes, Michelle Thompson, Nighet Riaz, Lynn Copeland, Heather Anderson and Jules Bell. These shows will be repeated tomorrow, Tuesday the 9th of March between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m, Wednesday the 10th of March between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m, Thursday the 11th between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m, and on Friday between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. Finally, Marlene and I would like to thank all the rest of the Indylive team that have helped us put this show together, particularly Jerry Mulvena, Steve Callahan and Fiona McGregor. And now, before our theme tune, Sisters Are Doing It For Themselves, we will play you out with a selection of messages from women in different languages. You'll hear from Carole Justafré from France, Monica Calvel-Monturiol from Catalonia, from here in Glasgow, Nighet Riaz and Tina Yu and Susan Duncan, and from Dundee, Joelle Kay. And you're going to hear them doing their greetings partly in English but also in French, Catalan, Farsi, Punjabi, Cantonese and Mandarin, and in Portuguese. We hope you enjoy it. Happy International Women's Day to you all.
Hello, everybody. Je m'appelle Carole Justafré, and I'm speaking from France. And I'm saying hello to everyone who's listening to Indylive Radio. Well, as it is La Journée Internationale des Femmes, and being a French woman, I wanted to say a few words. And I was telling some of my friends that being a woman is a challenge in itself, especially, even in Europe, because even if we have rights now, we still have to fight for equal pay. And in some countries within Europe, abortion is still a big problem. And there are people, even women, fighting against the right to abortion. And I think that for us women, the most important thing is to get an education and to have a job. Because as my great-grandmother told my mother years and years ago, never be financially dependent on a man. Get your job. And if one day something goes wrong, you can leave. So I know that even nowadays in the 21st century, because of some traditions, some religious traditions and, customs, women don't get access to education. They don't get access to, for example, the pill. And so they have children and life for them is very difficult. And as for us, for example, French women in France, at the beginning of the lockdown, the president decided to shut all the schools. And as most French women work, it was very difficult for them to keep the children at home. And they couldn't go to work. So most of the time, the husbands would go to work and the women would stay home. So to me, education and financial independence are the most important things for women around the world. And as long as there's a Journée Internationale des Femmes, it means that we'll have to fight till this Journée Internationale des Femmes disappears.
Hi, Indy audience. I am Monica from Barcelona in Catalonia. I want to send a warm hug in these hard times we are living. for the International Women's Day. I want to send you a lot of energy to keep on working for the Scottish independence. On this special day, I want to give all my support to all Catalan women unjustly imprisoned by the Spanish government, and also to Clara Ponsatí, who has been sheltered in my beloved Scotland. En aquest dia especial vull donar el meu suport a totes les dones empresonades injustament pel govern espanyol i també a la Clara Ponsatí, que s'ha pogut refugiar a la meva estimada Escòcia. Freedom for Scotland!
Hello, my name is Susan Duncan. I live in Glasgow. You are listening to Indylive Radio. Happy International Women's Day to you all. I was born in Iran, so I would like to do the same in Farsi. Rooz Bainulmalali Zan Mubarak. Choose to challenge gender toys. Buy your girls the science kit, the messy art project, or the robot. Encourage them to be loud, to challenge themselves, to explore and be brave. Choose to challenge male-dominated careers. Bring up your daughters to study engineering, mathematics, or science. Encourage them to follow their dreams. No career should be outwith their imagination. Choose to challenge our limits. Let's help our daughters to be independent. Build up their confidence and push them to go out and get what they want. Choose to challenge male-dominated pastimes. Join a martial art class, lift heavy weights, or take up CrossFit. Join a rock band, learn the double bass, or pick up a tuba. Choose to challenge the glass ceiling, push through barriers, and work towards your full potential. Pull other women up with you and encourage your peers to succeed. Happy International Women's Day to each one of you. روز بین المللی زن به همگی مبارک.
Hi, my name is Dr. Nighet Riaz, and you're listening to Indylive Radio on International Women's Day. I choose to challenge and disrupt the narrative and speak to power. I'm now going to repeat this in Punjabi. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste, Sat Sri Akal. Mera naam hai Dr. Nighet Riaz. Tusi sun rahe hai Indylive Radio on International Women's Day. मैं जो कह रही हूँ कि मैं है ना मुकाबला करूँगी और जिरी गाल बात है कि जो मैं सच का साथ दूँगी. Shukriya.
Hello everyone, this is Tina Yu. You're listening to Indylive Radio on International Women's Day. I'm just going to wish all our listeners good health and success in Mandarin and in Cantonese. 你好，祝大家，我叫做余玉晴 Tina Yu。你聽緊係 Indylive Radio， 係國際 International Women's Day。祝大家身體健康，萬事如意，馬到成功。
My name is João Kay, and I am so happy to be addressing you at Indylive Radio for International Women's Day special. I have been in Scotland for 4 decades, and I was attracted by the excellence of your universities and also by your extraordinary intellectual achievements through the centuries. I now have a Scottish husband and 3 Scottish children. I love the country and admire it tremendously. And the longer I live here, the more I admire it. I come from Portugal, and one of the greatest poets of the 20th century in Portugal and in Europe was Fernando Pessoa. And there is a line from one of his poems that I always think about when I think about Scotland. It's from a book that he wrote called Mensagem. He wrote it in the 30s, when we in Portugal were under political oppression, and we had lost the sense of who we were. And we needed someone to tell us, to remind us about our extraordinary contribution to world history, to the discoveries and many other achievements, looking at our faults, but also reminding us how much we had contributed, what our spirit of endurance, our qualities had led us to do, what the people can do. And the line from this poem is from, the poem is called Mar Português, Portuguese Sea. And the line is, tudo vale a pena, se a alma não é pequena. Aye, all things worth it, gin ye hae a soul that's muckle in you. Everything is worth it if your soul is big enough. Now, I've lived here for a long time, and I know that Scotland's soul is more than big enough for anything. So choose to challenge.
This is Marlene here, just briefly signing off at the end of these 4 fantastic programmes in celebration of International Women's Day. I really enjoyed hearing Val just read out the list of all our guests. It's an amazing bunch of women. One thing that struck me when I was listening to Val read out those names is that without the COVID pandemic, these 4 programmes probably would not have happened. I'm sure Valerie and I would have done something to celebrate International Women's Day. I'm sure we would have set up a few guests to come into the studio, and it's because we've got used to working remotely, producing programmes from home rather than always being in the studio, and of course become very familiar with using online platforms like Zoom. And out of that has come this array of women celebrating International Women's Day. Thank you all so much for being prepared to come along and contribute to the programme. And of course, although it's Val and I's voices who are on the actual programme, we couldn't have done it without the help of Fiona, Steve and Jerry working in the background, helping us with the odd technical glitch and coming up with suggestions about how to take the whole project forward. So very big thanks to them as well. And lastly, a big thanks to Val for having that idea in the first place, and then the 2 of us working together to make it happen.
Indylive.Radio. The daytime